So I know we have a lot of nurses here. Where are all of the non-nurse providers? Non-nurse, non-physician. Okay, not many of you. How many of you, of the non-nurse providers, are pissed off that EMS is not treated like a real profession? Good. I will tell you right now that a big part of that is because EMS is not engaged in research and is not engaged in evidence-based medicine. So pay attention to this, because EMS research is what you need to be involved in, is where you need to be going in order to get EMS recognized as a real profession. That's just a part of it. So, like Rob said, I was given the task of looking at all of the articles that were published in the last year and deciding which were the most worthy to present here. I worked with several EMS board certified physicians. So for those of you that don't know, EMS is now a recognized subspecialty within emergency medicine that you can get board certified in. So I worked with several people that are either board certified in EMS or in the midst of their fellowship to gather all these articles together and decide which were the most worthy to present to you. So like I was saying, you need science. You need research. If you are upset that your profession is not taken seriously, you need to be more evidence-based. How many of you know who Neil deGrasse Tyson is? Okay, good. So this is not lost on all of you. So, 2 airway articles. So I broke this down by sort of topic. So we've got two airway articles to cover. If you want to take pictures of the slides or anything, my last slide is actually going to have a link to Google Drive that has the slides and everything, and a link to additional resources. So you can just take a picture of the last slide rather than taking pictures of any of the references that I'm going to be covering in the middle here. So save your pictures for the last slide. So 2 airway articles. First one. Endotracheal intubation versus supraglottic airway. So it turns out this was a meta-analysis. So they took a bunch of articles, pooled all the data together, and did a analysis of all the sort of pooled data. And they found that endotracheal intubation was better than supraglottic airway for cardiac arrest patients, by about 30% in all patients. So that's for return of spontaneous circulation, for survival to discharge, for neurologically intact, all the markers that we care about, it was consistently about 30% better. However, there is a limitation to meta-analysis articles. How many of you would let a 5-year-old cut your hair? No takers? 1? Okay, I see 1. Right, so you've got a 5-year-old, but you know your average hairstylist is what, in their mid-20s maybe? Well, how many of you would let like 5-year-olds cut your hair? Because 5 times 25 is like in your mid-20s, so that's the same thing, right? Is it? No! So this is the problem with meta-analysis. You get crap in, you get crap out. If you pool a bunch of crap data, you get a bunch of crap analysis. Now, I didn't look at all the individual articles and the heterogeneity between the articles, but just to point out a limitation of meta-analysis is that when you pool a bunch of articles together, you have to have quality data in to get a quality conclusion. So when it comes to meta-analysis, If you have a bunch of junk articles all together, you're going to get junk out. So when you're looking at meta-analysis, it's important to read the methods section and to look at how the articles were selected, the heterogeneity between the articles, and that sort of detail. I didn't look at that for the specific analysis, but I know the first author, and I trust him that it's probably a pretty good article. So I do trust the conclusions of the paper based on his reputation, I guess. But just something I wanted to point out about meta-analysis. So, second article about airway. So, pediatric intubation by paramedics in a large EMS system. This sort of looks at some of the main complications and things that arise from paramedics doing pediatric intubation. No surprise, the most common indication for doing the intubation was cardiac arrest, and the most common complication was right mainstem intubation. That shouldn't surprise anyone. Your adrenaline's pumping, you're on a code with a kid, which you do not do that often, and you jam the ET tube down because you want to be sure it's past the cords and you get a right mainstem. So that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. So I think the take home from this article is that when you're doing a pediatric code, when you're doing the intubation, you need to double check to try and make sure that you don't have the right mainstem, just to be conscious that when your adrenaline's pumping, that's going to happen. The main caveat for this article was a single system and that they were doing RSI. So take what you will from that for extrapolating to your own system, whether or not you're using RSI. I'm not sure it makes that big of a difference when your main indication is cardiac arrest, but worth mentioning. So, trauma articles. One, talking about the golden hour. Who's familiar with the golden hour? Good. So, it's BS. So, this article, they looked at the golden hour and the indications and the time and the transport and all that stuff, and it's just total BS. It does not make a difference. So take your time on scene to stabilize the patient, put on the pelvic wrap, do your thoracotomies, whatever, stabilize the patient, skip the lights and sirens, drive safely, don't put yourself and other drivers at risk. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to put yourself and other people at risk rushing when there's no benefit. Because the 5 to 7 minutes that you save by going lights and sirens doesn't make a difference. So the main limitation of this study is that it was a secondary analysis of registry data. So there's all these large trauma registries where they collect lots and lots of patient data, and then people data mine out of it to try and get different research articles out of it. So they were pulling data out of this database. But the main problem with the study is that the database was not powered to detect the specific outcome that they were looking for. So to give you an idea of what statistical power is, so if I am trying to compare two groups of people, I need to have two sufficiently large groups to detect a difference between those groups. So, for example, if I'm looking at cardiac arrest outcomes, then I need to have enough cardiac arrest patients in, let's say, intubation versus supraglottic airway. I need to have enough patients in both groups to be able to statistically say that one is better than the other. That's sort of what statistical power is. This database was not designed to detect the specific outcome, so they didn't have enough people to specifically say that one was better than the other. So statistically, They cannot say that one is superior than the other. And while that may sound like they're on like a shaky basis for stating any of their conclusions, what you can say with statistics, because we use this arbitrary cutoff of 5% for statistical purposes. Of, if it's less than 0.05, then we call it statistically significant, versus if it's greater than 0.05, we say it's not statistically significant. That's sort of an arbitrary cutoff. But what they found was a non-significant trend, which means it was greater than 0.05, toward the decreased survival. So take it for what you will, but I would say if I were on scene, if I were managing a trauma, I would take my time on scene, I would stabilize the patient, I would probably not go lights and sirens because it does not save that much time and it does not make a huge difference in the patient outcome. Cardiac arrest, everyone's favorite topic. Lots of articles, many things to talk about. So, we all know from our recurrent CPR training, you gotta get back on the chest after the shock. And this article reaffirms that. Mainly because, so what they were looking at the defibrillation data from, so they were looking at the EKG data after the shock and how long it took to get an organized rhythm back. And it turns out, even after a quote-unquote successful shock, it takes at least 2 minutes, 2 full minutes, to get an organized rhythm back after a shock that's going to be successful. So the take-home message is you've got to get back on the chest immediately after a shock, because even if it's going to work, it's going to take 2 minutes, at least 2 minutes. So you've got to do 2 full minutes of CPR to keep the coronary and cerebral perfusion pressure up while that shock is going to quote-unquote take effect. So, limitations of this study, it's a registry data, again, which sort of, they're collecting lots of things and then people are looking at it afterwards, sort of try and pull conclusions out of it. It was a single site, which introduces an interesting variance in terms of socioeconomic status. I don't know how many of you are familiar with sort of social determinants of health, but socioeconomic status is very highly correlated with survivability from many, many different diseases, including cardiac arrest. So because this is a single site and they have sort of a skewed sample in terms of the population they have, that may sort of have affected the data, but I still think that the main message holds true, that you need to get back on the chest and that it takes at least 2 minutes for the shock to quote unquote take effect, and that the whole thing, the whole teaching about getting back on the chest right after the shock is so true, and that you need to get back on the chest. Okay, next CPR study. This is one of the more recent articles about mechanical CPR, which again, all of these articles about mechanical CPR have shown that there is no patient benefit. And I wonder why that is, because it seems like a machine doing CPR continuously, being able to do CPR continuously, not worrying about being able to shock while the thing's doing CPR and everything, you'd think that that would be better. But there's been no data to show that it's superior in terms of patient-oriented outcomes. And I think that there's potentially several reasons for this. One thing is, in all of these studies, the manual CPR, the people that are randomized doing manual CPR are getting almost typically monthly updates, well, not updates, but monthly training or refreshers on doing high-quality CPR. So I think that the people that are doing manual CPR are doing better CPR than Joe Schmo that has a cardiac arrest on State Street is getting. Because they're getting this constant update, they know that they're being randomized against the machine, and every month they're going to get refreshers on high quality CPR. I think that the people that are getting manual CPR in all of these studies are getting better manual CPR than the average cardiac arrest patient. Also, these studies are looking at all comers. Every single patient has cardiac arrest. So I think that there is probably a subgroup that is to be determined that will benefit from mechanical CPR that we have not determined yet. So, for example, if the patient is on the 7th floor of a building which has no elevator and only a narrow staircase with which to extricate them, they are not going to get quality CPR, quality manual CPR, while you are trying to get them down the stairs. It's not going to happen. That patient may, I think, benefit from having a mechanical chest squeezer during the time that they're being extricated. But none of these studies have looked at specific subgroups of patients benefiting from any of these devices. So all comers for mechanical CPR does not appear to benefit. However, specific subgroups, possibly. Also, I think while we're typically looking at patient-oriented outcomes, I think we also need to look at provider-oriented outcomes. So it is extremely dangerous. Well, number one, it has been proven in study after study that you cannot provide quality CPR in the back of a moving ambulance. You can't. Not possible. It's also extremely unsafe to the provider. Trying to do CPR, moving around, lights and sirens, bonk your head, whatever. It's not safe, it's not effective. However, mechanical CPR, safe, effective. You can have one medic in the back. You've got the mechanical chest pump going on. You've got one guy, he's already intubated, supraglottic air raid, whatever, just doing the drugs, doing the defibrillation, whatever. You can be belted in, you can be safe, you can be running the code. So I think that there are provider-oriented outcomes to mechanical CPR that are not being recognized in the current literature. So while the literature has shown that mechanical CPR is not effective, does not have patient-oriented outcomes, I think that there are still positive things associated with mechanical CPR that have not been looked at in the literature. All right, more CPR. AEDs are not perfect. Turns out in this large study where they looked at a bunch of AED data, almost 1 in 5 of the shockable rhythms were not correctly recognized by the AED. So I think the take home from this study is if you are trained to do manual defibrillation and manual rhythm recognition, you need to do it because an AED will be wrong almost 20% of the time. So if you're, because I mean, when I went to paramedic school, we were taught, oh, you can just put it on the AED setting and then you don't have to worry about the rhythm recognition. I think this study challenges that. You need to be looking at the rhythm, manually recognize it, because those automated algorithms that the AEDs are using are wrong a lot of the time. Main limitations of this study, it was an international study, and they were looking at a system where they were using physicians for the advanced life support in terms of the rhythm recognition. But I think we all know what VFib and VTAC look like, so I'm not so worried about that. Okay, continuous versus interrupted CPR. So this is doing CPR constantly versus 30 to 2. So they found that there was no benefit to continuous compressions versus doing 30 to 2. Main limitations, who's familiar, I've already described this already, but who's familiar with the term the Hawthorne effect? No one? Okay. So Hawthorne effect means that when people are being observed, that their behavior changes. So if you know that you're involved in a study that is looking at continuous versus 30 to 2 CPR, your behavior will change slightly. So these patients may have been getting different quality of CPR because the providers knew that they were being observed. Also, kind of an odd thing, even though they had a good randomization algorithm, there were imbalances between the two groups, which may have led to some possible confounding. So it wasn't a great study. It was just, basically they needed more people. They needed more people to kind of balance out some of the differences between the two CPR groups. And lastly, the post-resuscitation care was not part of the study protocol, which means that in terms of targeted temperature management, any of the other things that are typically involved with post-CPR care, those were not part of the study protocol, and it varied from site to site for the places that are involved with the study. So, not a great study in that sense, but I think the take home from this is that if you have been reading a lot of stuff about how sexy cardiocerebral resuscitation is, there's no reason to sort of like really push for it right now, because this pretty good quality study doesn't tend to support that continuous CPR is any better than 30 to 2. Okay, one about EMS systems. So, crowdsourcing CPR. Does anyone here have the PulsePoint app installed on their phone? No? Okay. So, PulsePoint is one of a couple different popular apps for this. So this study looked at crowdsourcing CPR for cardiac arrest. And basically, you install an app on your phone, and when there is a cardiac arrest that you are near, the dispatch center will page you based on the location of the arrest to say, there is a cardiac arrest within a few hundred feet of you at this location. They need help. So PulsePoint is one app. I can't remember the name of the other one, but it's linked in with the emergency medicine, the EM dispatch system. And when there's an arrest, you get paged if you're near one. I've yet to get paged. Fingers crossed. I keep hoping. But what they found was that crowdsourcing, using these apps, improved bystander CPR significantly, by like a lot. I think, if I recall, it almost doubled it. However, there was a non-statistically significant, so while it increased bystander CPR significantly, and other studies have demonstrated that bystander CPR is associated with improved outcomes, this study did not show an increase in 30-day survival. Now that's because this study was not powered to detect that difference. They were only trying to look at the increase in the bystander CPR. So the 30-day survival thing, I think we can extrapolate that the increase in bystander CPR will lead to better outcomes, because there are other studies that show that, but this study wasn't powered to do that because they would have needed a lot more patients, like I think almost 10 times more patients to be able to detect that difference. Limitations, this was done in the Netherlands. It's a single system, and there may be a greater benefit to places where there are longer response times. So if you code in downtown Salt Lake, and it's going to take Salt Lake City Fire, 3 to 5 minutes to get there, probably not the same if you're in, I don't know, Payson or somewhere in rural Utah with a volunteer fire department that's going to take 15 to 20 minutes to get there. There may be a greater benefit for patients that are further from getting that definitive care. So in urban areas, may not be that much of a benefit. However, I think with as more connected, as we're getting and is more popular as apps are getting, that this is going to kind of take off. Honestly, I think you should have to learn CPR to get your driver's license, at least chest compression only CPR. And, you know, this is a thing. This is a new thing. And if you're here today, you should install the PulsePoint app or any of the other crowdsourced CPR apps. Because in the unlikely event that you are near a cardiac arrest, I mean, it could make a big difference for someone. Okay, 2 STEMI studies. This one looked at BLS providers and their ability. We all know that ALS providers, paramedics, can determine that someone's having a STEMI and kind of bypass the local emergency department and go to the STEMI center and do PCI and all that. This study was looking at BLS providers, okay, your EMT basics, and their ability to bypass the local ED and go to a cath lab. And they found that EMT basics were able to do that. They were able to manage the patients successfully and safely during that time interval. Main limitations, this was done in Canada, where there are significantly different educational standards. So what they call, so in Canada, everyone's called a paramedic, even if they're BLS providers, they're called a primary care paramedic. Their BLS provider has a significantly higher level of education than our EMT basic in the United States. So take what you will from that in terms of the differences in education. However, I think that considering that the main thing that we are worried about with a STEMI patient or a chest pain patient is arrhythmia and cardiac arrest management, that an EMT basic is able to provide that during the time interval for their transport. Even if they're just using an AED or whatever, even if the AED is wrong almost 20% of the time. But BLS providers are able to manage STEMI patients in the interval that it takes to get from, to bypass a local emergency department and get to a PCI center. Okay, another important one. Air, 21% oxygen versus 100% oxygen for STEMI patients. So the current AHA guidelines are what?
Place on oxygen.
Place them on oxygen if,
O2 stats are less than.
yeah, if they're hypoxic, if they're less than 95%. But when was the last time you had a chest pain patient come in the ER that someone didn't just throw a nasal cannula on reflexively? Right? Everyone gets oxygen. Turns out we might be doing more harm than good. So this study specifically looked at patients that were having STEMI, and then they were randomized to either receive oxygen the whole time or receive air the whole time. They excluded patients that were hypoxemic because they needed oxygen. So these were all patients that were not hypoxic. And it turns out that when oxygen was given to STEMI patients, that they had larger infarcts and higher rates of reinfarct and arrhythmias. Sounds a lot like we're doing harm. There were no changes in 6-month mortality, ejection fraction, or the troponin level, but the main limitation of the study was that even though this was billed as a pre-hospital article and was put in a pre-hospital journal, these patients were not actually randomized to the air or oxygen arm until they arrived at the hospital. So whether the pre-hospital administration of oxygen makes a difference cannot be determined from this study specifically because basically everyone got oxygen in pre-hospital, and then once they got to the hospital, it changed to one or the other. But I think we can sort of extrapolate that giving oxygen to patients, giving high flow oxygen to patients that don't need it appears to be associated with more harm than good. So we need to respect the AHA guideline that we only administer oxygen to patients that are hypoxemic, which I realize I'm just saying follow the guideline, but I'm also recognizing that most of us don't actually follow the guideline and that basically everyone gets oxygen. So check yourself before you wreck yourself and think before you throw on that nasal cannula. So that's it. Like I was saying, if you want to take a picture of one slide, this is the slide. That link is to a Google Drive that has the slides and some additional resources. That QR code is to that link. So I will try to post a Word doc in that same folder before the end of the day that has the links to the PubMed for all those articles so that you can look them up at your leisure. Specifically, if you work for Intermountain Healthcare, the librarian in the medical library here can get you copies of any of these articles that are here. I'm sure that they have subscriptions to all those journals. So if you give her the DOI or the reference to the article, I'm sure she'll be able to get it for you if you want to actually read the full text. So I'll try to get that posted before the end of the day, but it will be in that same folder. Thank you.
Any question for Matt? So my question, Matt, is if I am interested in knowing about research but don't have the ability to actually interpret a study, or I'm the world's worst mathematician, what's the easiest way to kind of keep up in the laziest way possible?
That is, in fact, the way that I keep up with literature. So, if you want to keep up with literature, but you are, in fact, lazy and or time crunched like myself, the best way to do it is an app called Read by QXMD. You download the app on your phone, you select which journals you want to subscribe to, which specific subject areas. There's all kinds of ways to sort of determine what your interests are. And then every time you open the app, it will tell you, oh, hey, there's all these new articles in this subject, or there's this new article in this journal, or whatever. And you're sort of hand-delivered all of this research, and you can look at the abstracts. The other great thing about Read by QXMD is that if you have an institutional subscription to a journal, you're able to download the full text and read it on whatever device you're using. So if you are on, so I think specifically for Intermountain, if you are on the Intermountain Wireless, you'll be able to download the full text. You'll be able to download the full PDF so you can look at it another time. But if you're associated like with the University of Utah or something, you may be able to put in your login credentials and then it will download the article through that. But you can put in whatever institutional associations you have and it will download the full text of those articles. And honestly, that's the way that I produced this presentation, was for the last year, I open this article, I open this app a couple times a week, and I go through all these articles, and when I find an interesting article, I kind of save it for later, and then I have this big list of articles at the end of the year, and I share it with all these other people that are way smarter than me, and we kind of determine which ones are the best to keep up with. But the way that I keep up with it, the laziest way possible to keep up with research, I think Read by QXMD.
All right, thanks, Matt. He also didn't jump at an opportunity for some shameless self-promotion. The other thing you can do if you want to be even lazier and not actually read a journal article, lifeinthefastlane.com is the mother or grandmother or grandfather of all of the social media websites, and each week experts from around the world, including Matt Goebel, will kind of scan every podcast and blog and decide what was great and what was terrible, and there'll be a list of 5 to 10 interesting blogs or podcasts on a variety of topics: critical care, emergency medicine, education, radiology, pre-hospital. So it's another way to keep up, and you can have that emailed to you from the lifeinthefastlane.com website. So the even lazier way to keep up.
Yeah, so there is the Life in the Fast Lane review, which you're talking about, which looks at all of the FOAMed resources. But Life in the Fast Lane also has the research and reviews, R&R in the Fast Lane, which is specifically looking at research. And that is the ultimate in laziness for keeping up with the research, the R&R in the Fast Lane. And that is, I do not contribute to that specific one because they try to keep that to only physicians, and I'm only halfway there. So, but I do contribute to the Life in the Fast Lane review, which is all the FOAMed stuff. But yes, the ultimate in laziness is the Life in the Fast Lane, R&R in the Fast Lane, where every week or so they publish kind of the top articles with links to all of them.
All right, thank you, Mayor.